Okay, so we left off here last week. We're gonna finish yeah. Sure, yeah, that would be great. I think there were a few submissions. I saw it. I saw the name and the face, and I could match them. I don't know, like I know your faces and I know your names, but I don't know which face go which name. So it would be nice to see who the person is. Yeah. All right. So attention. So we started on attention last week. We're gonna finish it today. Um, where we left off was talking about the normal mechanisms of selective attention. Uh, we had a somewhat long discussion about why in an experiment like this, the monkey would remain fixated in the same location, because if not, the receptive field would move. So imagine this experiment starts. The monkey is, these are all schematics, right? This is not the actual experiment, but the schematic of it is that there's a fixation point, there's a receptive field large enough that you could put two objects in it. So these aren't receptive field in very early visual areas. These are receptive fields a little higher up in that hierarchy that we discussed. So you're placing two objects, and the two objects that they place in this experiment, one of them is a preferred, which I'm showing with the blue vertical bar, and one of them is non-preferred, which is the horizontal green bar. The blue vertical bar here is preferred. It means that if it is presented by itself, it would really drive the cell. It would really elicit a strong firing rate from the cell. The green horizontal bar is the non-preferred stimulus. So when it's presented by itself, it's not going to elicit a very strong response. However, as we discussed last time, not even a strong response could be part of the representation of this stimulus, right? Because it's eliciting maybe a strong response from other cells, and that contrast is what signals this object, right? We talked about how when you have a distributed representation, there is a ratio of activation among a lot of different cells that would represent an object. Now, if the monkey is instructed to look, to attend, not look, like looking requires you to move your eye to some extent. If the monkey is instructed to attend covertly to the blue bar here. Now, attending covertly means that we're going to get into it maybe next week a little more. Covertly means that you're not moving your eye, right? And you're, I don't know if you use this example, imagine you're in a bar or something, and someone says, "Oh, look at this person at 3 o'clock or something," and then you're not moving your eyes, but you're attending to somewhere out here, and that's called a covert attention. So the eye remains fixated here, and the monkey covertly attends to the blue object. Now, what they observed is that when the monkey, without moving its eye, covertly attends to the blue object, the response of the cell goes up. Almost as high as when the blue object was presented by itself. So in these two conditions, what's the difference? In one of them, there are two objects in the receptive field, and the monkey is attending to one of them. You have a very high response from the cell. In this case, only blue object is presented, and the response is really high because it's a preferred stimulus. So what they hypothesize, or how they formulated, is that what attention does is, in a way, what we call spatial attention in this case, because it's attending to an area in a space or an object in a space. It effectively shrinks the receptive field of the cell around the attended object. Now, effectively, because in reality, the receptive fields cannot shrink. Why is that? Why can't the receptive field shrink? That quickly, at least. What determines the receptive field of a cell? Yeah.
Is it by like the certain other cells that converge on it?
Yeah.
So yeah, it seems like kind of strange idea that they could sort of switch, like, you know, in response to an external stimulus.
Yes. So because it's defined by connections, right? What determines the receptive field of a cell is all the connections it has up to that point, right? Certain other activity converges on this one, other activity converge on those, and then there are some receptive fields in some receptors in the eye, photoreceptors in the eye that converge on that. So the actual receptive field cannot shrink technically because it's your connectivity and it doesn't change that quickly. But the effective the effective receptive field can shrink, meaning that the cell could become responsive to only a part of its receptive field because of top-down modulation. Now, this is what attention is. When you're spatially attending to an area, you're modulating this pathway in a way that the effective receptive field shrinks. Now, bias competition theory of attention, which is pretty much what a lot of people think of the neural mechanism of attention is, says that attention biases competition among objects for representation. That's a loaded sentence. There is competition between these two objects. What is the competition for? What's this competition between the objects? No, in the brain, what is the competition? Attention, yes, on a high level, they're competing for attention. But what is in the brain, what are they competing for? Firing rate, right? I think I said this many times. What's all there in the brain? What is it that it's in the brain that we care about? Like I said, brain are like, there are two things that happens in the brain. What are those two things? I think I mentioned. No. Like in terms of the currency in the brain is activation and connections, right? You should always think about the system in those terms, that you have connections and you have activations, and connections cause those activations. When these two objects are in the receptive field of the cell, they're competing for representation. They're competing to control the response of this cell. That's what the competition is. Does that make sense to everyone? They want to control the response of this cell. The blue bar says, okay, the response of the cell should be, 20 action potential per second. The green one says, no, it should be like, 5 action potential per second, right? They're competing to control the response of this cell. Now, controlling the response of a cell eventually leads to being represented, right? Take, like the metaphor works as we talk about it in society as well. Meaning that when an object wants to be represented in the brain, it means what? What would that look like when an object wants to be represented in the brain? Again, what's in the brain? There are activations, right? So when an object wants to be represented in the brain, it wants the brain for the cells to respond in a way that its properties are being the properties of these objects are being reflected in that response. That's what that means. So the competition is between the objects to control the response of the cell, not just one cell, but the entire brain area, probably, right? They're not just competing for one cell. These cells are in the receptive field. These objects are in the receptive field of many, many cells. And when you go a level higher, the receptive fields get much bigger, and the same objects are in the receptive field of those cells. So the competition is for controlling the response of the cell. And the competition is for representation. It means that how does something get represented in the brain? Well, through activations. If you control the activation of the cells, you are being represented. You're trying to be represented in the brain. Now, in this case, because the attention went to the blue object, right? The fixation is here, the blue object is here. Because the attention went to the blue object gets to control the response of the cell. So the response of the cell becomes as if only blue object was in it. So it's an as if statement. It's not really the case that only blue objects is in the receptive field. but the cell responds as if only the blue object was in the receptacle. Does that make sense? So the competition there is in controlling the response of the cell. Attention modulates that. It biases that competition. If there is no attention, the response of the cell is somewhere in between. Both objects are impacting the response of the cell. But when the attention, which is in this case a spatial attention, because the two objects are two different locations in the space, so you could attend to one object in space and not the other, that object gets to control the response of the cell. Alternatively, if the monkey was instructed to attend to the green object, because they get rewarded when they attend to green objects and then later on have to respond something about it, the response of the cell would be, the cell would not fire as much, as if, and the response is as if only the green object was in the receptacle, right? As I said, it's an as if statement. It's very dynamic, because in one moment, when there are two objects in a receptacle of a cell, in one moment you could attend to one object, in another moment you could attend to the other object. So this is very dynamic, right? Attention is dynamically modulating the response of the cell. So the bias competition theory of attention says that attention biases competition among objects for representation. Does that statement make sense to everyone? Like different aspects of that statement? So, as I said, this is just one cell, right? We're just looking at one cell here. But imagine that in order for you to engage with an object, in order for you to answer questions about it, in order to for you to act upon it, that object has to be represented in the brain, right? This is what we talked about. So far, before this lecture, we were talking about objects appearing by themselves. So when you're looking at one object, if I'm looking at those cookies or muffins, only those objects are being represented in my brain, right? I don't see much of a competition. And those objects are, and then you could ask me questions about it. Do I think they're soft? Probably, right? So I could answer questions about it only because they're being represented in the brain. If they're not represented, if there is not a representation of them, if their features and their properties are not being signaled by different neurons in my brain, I'm not going to be able to answer them. If you tell me how many of them there are, well, I have to attend to it in order to tell you how many of them there are, right? Does that make sense? This is important. That in the brain, everything has to be represented for you to act upon it, for you to answer questions about it. So the currency of the brain are those activations, or how much activations you're controlling, how much activation an object is controlling. And attention can modulate that. If you're attending to one thing, that comes at a cost, as we talked about last week, for representing other things. So if you're driving, if you get a text message and you start reading the text message, right? You're representing whatever that text message is in your head. You're not representing the world that allows you to act upon it. So it's important that that we think about everything in a sense that if I want to do any sort of computation on things, any sort of answering questions, anything, they have to be represented in the brain. That's why attention is required for you to do any cognitively demanding task, is that you have to represent the features of that object in your brain in order for you to answer questions about it. So there are some, I don't know if I assigned this paper as a potential reading for the assignment too, but there are studies where you could have multiple objects in the visual world, and then have people like somebody's fixated here, you have like multiple objects, and then these objects are being, as I said, all objects are pretty much represented by the visual input at early areas. But when you go higher, when the receptive fields get bigger and there are multiple objects in them, then attention really makes a difference in your decoding. Like, what is decoding? Decoding is that I look at the activity in the brain, and from that activity, I want to decide which object you're attending to, right? So let's say the subject decides, let's say there's a car and a house and an apple, and then the subject attends to one of them. Can I decode from their brain which one they're attending to? You can. Why? Because when they're attending to one of them, the representation changes to represent the features of that object. Now, you have to train a model to do the decoding. We're not going to get into that. We'll talk about maybe some of the brain-computer interfaces later, and then you'll see what I mean by decoding. But just know that the representation, the activations of the cells in that area are signaling something about the object that is being attended to versus the ones that's not being attended to. So attention biases competition among objects for representation. Any questions? All right. So you could do this experiment. A lot of these experiments were done in neurophysiology. So they were recording from single cells or from a bunch of cells, but they were actually recording action potentials. You could do some version of these attention experiments in the fMRI. In this case, you have faces and houses that are overlaid. As you could see the house and you could see the face. And you could basically instruct people. In this case, this is done in people, and you could instruct them to attend to one object or another object. Now, there are brain areas. There's a brain area called fusiform face area, or FFA, where it is very face selective. There's another brain area called parahippocampal place area that is selective to houses. Faces and houses are two categories that a lot of people have studied because they're very common and they elicit strong responses. Now, when you look here, when people are instructed to attend to face, you see it in this blue bar, versus attended to house versus attended to motion. You could see in FFA, when people are instructed to attend to face, you could see higher response in this brain area that is face selective. You could see a different pattern when people are instructed to attend to houses in the parahippocampal place area. You could see that there is a higher activation in PPA. So what this shows is that if a place is face selective, if an area is face selective and people are instructed to attend to faces, you're going to see higher activation in that area. It's much coarser, right? This is fMRI. This is activity from thousands of neurons that are, and then the area has millions of neurons. But also note that because this is the bold signal that we talked about before, blood oxygenation, the signal change is kind of small. It's not like a huge change, but you could still detect it. But yeah, so this is called object-based attention because the objects are on top of each other. So you're not really spatially attending. If objects are separated from each other, you could have a spatial attention. You could spatially attend to this, muffins, or spatially attend to something else. But when the objects are on top of each other, your attention goes from one object to another object and then back. So it's not really spatial. So it's a different form of attention, but the effect is similar, that the cells that are more selective for the object that you're attending to going to have a stronger response. Right? Does that make sense? So the cells that are more selective for the object, in this case, cells that are more selective for faces, going to have a stronger response when you're attending to faces. Yeah? Any questions so far? Everything's clear about these experiments? Yeah.
Maybe this was in the slide.
Mhm.
But so if there's no, like, say, top-down modulation, like, you're not asking anyone to, like, pick out a specific thing.
Mhm.
The assumption is just that with all those different kind of areas, or like, that the firing rates must be kind of averaged out. At least I kind of understood that with, like, in this experiment, how, like, the firing rate of that cell would just be the average of the two objects.
Mhm.
But in the case that you just brought up with, like, the different, like, whether it be faces, places, or motion, what, like, if there is no top-down modulation, what is, like, what should be the result?
Same here. So motion in this case was objects actually moving. And in a way, you're not attending to a face or the house, but you're attending to the movement, supposedly. And that would be somewhere in between. I don't know how reliable this is. That so this is supposed to be that control that you're asking for. And they found that in many cases, it is somewhere in between. But if it's in the MT area, we talked about MT as a motion area, I think at some point in the parietal lobe. And that one has a slightly stronger response when you're attending to motion versus the other. I'm not sure how reliable this is, but also the activity being averaged out is like mostly a simplification, I would say. In many cases, it wouldn't probably, like you probably are either attending to one of these objects that you find, relevant to the task, or you're attending to something else. So I'm not sure how reliable that is. But the idea is that if you're not attending to either of them, you're just, let's say, maintaining fixation, the cell is not being really closer or farther from the response of either of them. Sometimes one object is more salient, and that would do the job, because we'll talk about some bottom-up saliency stuff, meaning that if an object is more salient, it would control the representation later on just for the sake of being salient. But yeah, overall, like, the idea is that if you're not attending to either objects, the activity should be somewhere in between. Yeah.
So really, is it right to say that we're looking here at like what happens in the brain when we're like consciously attending to objects, right? We're not like sort of thinking about the different sorts of levels of like attention, right?
What are different levels of attention?
Like sometimes I can't help but attend to something. Like you could start throwing these muffins around the room, and I would be so shocked. Like I have to sort of attend to that, or like someone screaming on something like that. But then, like I attend to objects like throughout the day and act on them without like being really like consciously aware of them. Like I mean, like the phenomenologist example is like pushing. Like I had to enter the door by like turning the handle or pushing the door here, but I didn't really think about that. I wasn't like attending to that in a conscious way, yet I had to sort of engage with this object on some level to be able to get in. And so like I guess just like attention happen. Like it seems like there's different ways like we attend to things, and sometimes we attend to things that we might not be aware of.
So
If this is like not relevant, like I guess I'm just trying to like understand like the framework. Like it's like these experiments are sort of like tracking like the way we attend to, or tracking that we attend to an object, what happens in the brain.
yeah, I think these are all, so I think the mapping of attending or not attending, and whether it's a conscious, something that you could consciously later report on or not.
Yeah.
I feel like it's not a clean mapping, so I understand the confusion in terms of what, because you're saying that's fair. I could, sometimes if you drive even, right? Drive is supposedly a cognitively demanding task, but sometimes you drive from one block to another, or you ride a bike from a block to another, and then you don't really have a memory of how it happened and stuff like that. But you did all the right thing.
Especially like the visual thing.
Yeah. So a lot of people, and again, this is a popular way of thinking about it. There's a famous book about it too, like talking about system 1 and system 2, those sorts of things. Yeah. So, and that sort of thinking is also common in psychologists or cognitive scientists, where you're thinking when something becomes that habitual, then it doesn't require attention, right? In a sense that if you could do this habitually, then you're not exerting too much top-down attention to it. So there are pathways that connect those sorts of, so let's say you're seeing a handle and then you opened it up and then you came in and you didn't think about it. You don't have no memory of doing all those things.
Yeah.
In a way, there were some pathways that connected your vision to your action area, and then you acted upon it without any of them requiring attention or for it to reach consciousness. So I think that's the explanation.
Yeah.
Do I think there are different graded level of attention? It's possible, but in this course, we don't really talk about it that way. It's like certain things you're attending to when they reach awareness, and certain things you're not attending and they don't reach awareness. But that doesn't mean you cannot act upon them, right? A lot of time, as you said, you could come through a door and act upon the handle and everything, but it's not necessarily attention demanding, something like that. So I would say, I mean, I started with the definition last time, right? The way I'm using the term attention here, a lot of time it requires you to be able to like be aware of like what you looked at, something like that.
Yeah.
And in the brain, you could study that. Like you could potentially study neural activity for those engagement that didn't reach conscious awareness and those that they did. And then think about that. Like we're not going to talk about it here, but those are harder to study in a lot of ways. Because then, it's like, how do you know this? How do you not know this? You could put people through doing some habitual work and then see what the activation would be. And my guess is at some level, you could decode that information from earlier areas, but not from higher areas, probably. All right. So we're talking about selective attention. And selective attention, the way that we're describing here, is the serial process that we're talking about. Where the serial process is that this is an operation that you could do one at a time. Like a lot of things, you have some intuition about this, that there are certain things in life that you cannot do all at once. You have to just do it one by one. Sometimes you have to count something or you have to do some operations, and it's just a one step at a time thing. Parallel processing is an operation where you could perform on multiple objects simultaneously. Now, selective attention, the attention that we're talking about it here, is a serial process that relies on parallel processing. Now, what does that mean? Well, we talked about parallel processing earlier, and I gave you an example of how when you look at the world, right, there are these feature detectors. These are these, orientation columns in the back of the brain where the visual world gets projected to that area, and then you're detecting all these different orientations in the world. So if I'm looking at the world and there are different vertical orientations here that are projecting into my eye, they go to the back of the brain, and then those cells that are selective for vertical bars would be responsive when they have the receptive field on that area. So all of this is happening in parallel. The world is being processed in parallel, right? You can imagine when you take a picture of the world, that happens too, right? In your camera, the entire image is being processed in parallel for it to be saved as one image. But then when you have to do a task, when you get a visual input and you have to do a task, in this case, for example, counting the number of players on this field, well, then you would have to attend to individual players and then maybe see how many of them there are, maybe even look at the area for the batters and then see if someone's standing there or not. You know what city this is? Pittsburgh. You're from Pittsburgh. This is Pittsburgh. And you look at individual objects to count them, for example. I'm just saying as an example. But you have a general impression of the scene where we talked about it earlier, where, for example, in terms of the gist of the scene, I don't think I called it the gist of the scene, but when you were trying to recognize objects that are blurry in a scene, you use the general information of the scene in order to help you do that. In this case, also, that general impression of the scene comes from that parallel processing, and then you could serially attend to stuff that are relevant. A lot of these studies of attention and serial processing started from this work of Yarbus. So he showed people a painting. This is this painting called An Unexpected Visitor, and asked them different questions. So this is the eye movement of the people. So the people are looking at this image in order to answer certain questions. And where they're looking in the image is recorded. You could have people freely examine the picture, right? This is just looking around, seeing what this picture is about. Or you could ask them a questions. What are their ages? Or you could ask them to remember the clothes. Or how long has the unexpected visitor been away? So when you ask this question, when you are asked this question, this is a specific one, and then you look at the image, what do you think the pattern of activation, what do you think the pattern of attention, serial attention would be? If I had asked you, well, look at this picture and tell me how long do you think this unexpected visitor been away? Where are you attending to? Yeah, and then you kind of go back and forth maybe between the faces. Like what clues would you be looking for?
Indicates the passage of time.
Yeah, so what these are showing is the pattern of that serial attention that I was talking about. That serially you're attending to different parts of this image in order to answer certain questions, and that's what serial attention is, right? That there is, and we're going to talk more about this, there is this parallel processing to get the gist of the scene, but in order for you to specifically do a task and engage with the visual world, you have to look at it in a certain serial pattern, attend to different areas. You could imagine artists would use this a lot if they understand, they do understand how people look at the scene, and they could, guide your attention in different ways depending on how they want you to perceive the scene.
Those eye tracking movements?
Yes. So back then it was hard to track people's eyes. Now it's much easier. There are industrial devices you could buy and do experiment in the lab. But also now there are a lot of eye tracking in these wearables that are coming out. Like I think Apple Vision Pros have eye tracking, and Meta Quest, is that what they're called? Those do have eye tracking, and the way they work are usually based on cameras. So they have cameras inward facing the eye. So as the eye move around, they could record it, and then they project that direction into the image in front of you, and then they know where you're looking at. What's that? The ads. Do they have ads in there?
No.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, so basically you could, and again, this is a marketing thing, as you said, a lot of people do market research on eye tracking devices, meaning that like if you go to a store and then you're looking around, more recently it's been possible to actually have wearables that have eye tracking, so you could actually track if you have an outward camera and you have an inward camera, you could record the eye and you could see which products they're attending to as a form of market research. So the way to study parallel and serial processing in the brain, a lot of people use a visual search task. And the visual search task is you have a target. Again, we're using oriented bars here for the schematics. You have a target, and then you have a display, and your job is to search in that display and say whether the target was present or absent. As you can imagine, you would have to need both conditions, because if it was all present, it wouldn't be a task. If it was all absent, it wouldn't be a task. So they're all mingled, like interleaved. And the number of objects in the display is usually called set size. And you could vary that. You could play around with that. So let's say let's say your target is this red vertical bar. And then if it's in the target, you could say present. If it's in the display, you could say present. And if it's absent, you could say absent. Present. Absent. Present. All right. So these are the search displays, and they were not difficult, right? They were fairly easy. Do you think adding distractors made the search difficult, going from here to here? Not really, right? It didn't look like adding distractors, this is as easy. They seem equally easy. Do you think doing the search for when the target was absent was particularly difficult? No, not really, right? It looked like you could do this in, equally quickly. So if you actually come here and plot the search time based on the set size, you could see that the target absent and target present conditions are very close to each other. So as you increase the number of distractors and the total number of objects in the display, the search time stays flat, right? It doesn't really, if you go back here and even add more green vertical bars, it's not gonna increase your search time. And the target absent is probably slightly, longer, just because you want to make sure and say absent, but it also stays flat when you add more object to it. You could say that this behavior is like a parallel search behavior, right? Meaning that you're processing all the objects in the scene at once. You're not really impacted by the number of objects. You're doing parallel processing. Now, let's do some more search trials. Same target, present if it's present, absent if it's absent. Is this present? Absent. Present. Present. All right, so what do you think? Does adding distractors made it more difficult? So I think when we went from here to here, it was significantly more difficult. Do you think the absent was harder than the present? Do you think it took longer? Yes. Target absent judgment typically takes longer than target present judgment. Now, when you look at the behavior, when you look at the search time as a function of set size, you see that you have this slope where as you have more objects, the search time gets longer for the target present case and for the target absent case. But for those of you who've taken the stats, there's an interaction here, right? So as you get, as the set size get longer, the target absent search gets significantly more difficult than the target present search. The reason being that you have to scan the whole image now. This is not, when you want to say absent, you have to exhaustively search the space in order to get to the decision that is absent. But for the present, at least half the time, so on average, even if you're not guided, and guided search is not something I'm going to talk about, but even if your behavior is not guided, it's still, you're going to probably find the target half, after looking at half of the objects on average, and say, yes, so it would be significantly better than target absent. But a lot of time in life, like search is not just randomly looking at an object until you arrive at the target. When you look for your, keys, you look on surfaces, right? So knowing, this is what we talked about, like perceptual intelligence and scene related stuff. When you know something about the scene, you know certain areas are more likely to include your object, so you search that area. You're not going to search just randomly until you land on the target. But even not considering that, target presence search would be, faster, and they have nonlinear relationships that we're not going to get into here. But as you have more objects, you're going to be, this difference going to be bigger and bigger because it's half of that. But early on, there are other things that contribute to the search behavior, but yeah, let's not worry about that. So when you compare the two things, when you compare the two behavior, you see something like this. You have the type of search that doesn't change, the reaction time does not change with the number of objects in the display, and you have the type of search when the reaction time changes. Now, the reason, let's look at the displays that we had for the two search tasks. In this case, each object is processed at the same time, meaning that everything is being processed in parallel. And in parallel, you could say, well, there is a target. In this case, however, not all objects can be processed in parallel, but rather you're looking at one object, and then you look at another object, and then another object. And then when you look at enough objects, then you could say, well, this is the target, or the target is not present. So in this case, for you to say absent, you almost looked at every single object to be sure to say absent. But when the display was completely green objects, you didn't have to look at every single object. In parallel, you could say, well, the target is absent. Okay. And as I said, in target present trials, on average, you only look at half of the object, so you're much faster, at least in that sense. So I have a demo. I wanted to show you a search task. Let's see. Where's Waldo? That's the. Okay, so many of you have done this search task, right? The task is, where is Waldo? For those of you who don't know, it's a guy who's wearing red striped shirt and hat, right? And blue pants and a bag. Where is people found him? Here, right? So this is now this is a serial or parallel search. It's serial, right? You have to look at a lot of different locations in order to land on, okay, this is Waldo. Now this is a display, like this is a game that is made, intentionally difficult. But we do search tasks all the time, right? The search behavior is like the most common behavior we do in life. Like you're looking for your keys, or in a drawer, you're looking for, go to a restaurant and you want to know what the salmon option is. So you're searching for the word salmon, or you want to know the dessert. So you're looking, or on your phone, you're looking for an app and you know what it looks like. So you look around and then until you find the app. So, or you're on a website. Like we do this so many times in one day that we're searching for something and we find it. And a lot of time, right, that search is serial. You have to look around until you find it. In this case, why do you think searching is so difficult for Waldo?
Potential, what, if you remember what the term was, there's just so many objects.
Mm-hmm.
Would this be serial?
Yeah. But what makes it a serial search? What makes it a difficult search?
you're looking at cars, like you're looking one by one, rather than
So, yes, exactly. So, and as you said, there are so many potential places to look. What makes them a potential place?
Using like similar visual stimuli.
Mhm.
Stripes and a lot of stripes. You know, you're looking for red, there's red in a lot of different places. There's other.
Exactly, right? Too many men. But so what makes Waldo Waldo? Think about what we talked about distributed representations, right? What makes him Waldo? What's that? Yeah, so is it that he has blue pants? Is that what makes him Waldo? Is it that he has red striped shirt? Right? It's a combination, right? It's a distributed representation, and it's a combination of many factors that makes him who he is. It sounds deeper than it should. But the idea is, so let's get back to this. Let's look at the two search tasks that we had. In one search task, what makes the target target? Just the color, right? There's only one feature that makes the target target. In this case, the fact that the target is red and all the distractors are green. So this is not, it does not require you to combine multiple features in order to find the target. In this case, what makes the target? Orientation and color, right? So it's not just one factor that defines your target, but rather it's a combination of factors. It's that it's not just its orientation that makes it a target. It's not just its color that it makes it a target. It has to be red and it has to be vertical in order for you to find the target. Now, it's not the properties of the target that makes it a difficult search task or a serial search task. What makes it a search task?
The discrimination. Discrimination in terms of, you know, other options. Like we can add it like size, for example.
You can what?
We can add size, for example.
Yeah.
And the search,
Mm.
but should the still like the object still remain the same.
Yes. So did you want to say something here?
I was just gonna say, it's this right, like you called out.
Exactly, right? So as also you said, so it's not what makes a search behavior difficult is not just the properties of the target, right? The target hasn't changed. When you go from here, the target is the same red vertical object. But the fact that it's surrounded now by other red objects as well as vertical objects, that's what makes it difficult. Now, if all these, let's say I turn all these green objects and make them horizontal. What do you think this search task would be easy or difficult after that? It would be easier because why? Yes, so now you don't have to look at color anymore, just orientation would be enough because that's what separates target from a distractor. Now, when you think about some of the modularity stuff we talked about a few weeks ago, there are areas that people believe that are representing orientation, right? There are like V1, V2, we talked about, they represent orientation of objects in parallel. So then when you look at this image, all those orientations are processed. There are areas that are representing color. And like we talked about, V4 being a big part of that circuit. When you look at a task like this, with just that map, with the map of color, you could decide where the target is or whether there is a target or not, right? And a lot of time those two go together, where and what go together, you're processing them at this, you know, in parallel at the same time. So in these cases, when you get the map, when you get one specific color map, that's enough. You could say, well, there is something red in this map, so my job is done. You could respond quickly. In this case, however, you have an orientation map somewhere, you have a color map somewhere. The challenge is you have to combine the two in order to know what the target is. You don't have a map yet where all the colors or orientation of different objects are clearly bound together. So what makes this task difficult is that you have to use your attention in order to go to different places in order for the representation of those objects, for the distributed features of those objects to be bound together. And this is what feature integration theory is. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then when we come back, we'll continue. So 7:08, you're definitely a slide.
Please eat some muffins. I don't wanna take it with me. Thank you, Carlos.
So let's resume the class. So to put together a lot of these findings, this feature integration theory of attention was proposed, and to this day, is still a lot of people think of attention this way, where the idea is that, as we talked about it in the context of distributed representation, we said that while a lot of features are distributed in the visual area, even in the visual area, when you are representing something, right? Let's say a face of a person or an object in this case, the features could come from, they could be processed in different places, and they're not in the same cell that you have all those features. Like one cell would not respond to this, so the representation is distributed. The features of one object, and again, motion could be in a different place, like even different lobe and color and form being shape. The problem of binding refers to how do you bind all those features to get some coherent percept, right? If I want to get the features of this bottle are all scattered, then how do I get that coherent percept of this object? And the idea is that attention would do that job for you. Attention is putting together all these features, kind of binding all these features together in order to create that percept. So how do we know which feature belong to the same object? For a lot of time, this has many factors go into it. But a space is a big factor, right? Things that are next to each other in a space are likely part of the same object. So it's not even easy to define what an object is. It's not like a simple thing that you could define. But the definition that works for a lot of people is that if you take part of an object and pull it, the rest of the object would come with it, right? I don't know if that definition helps her. So in this case, this whole pineapple would be an object, because if you pick part of it and then pull it, the whole thing gonna come. That whatever comes with it is part of that object. You can imagine this is a big problem, and let's say a lot of time in computer vision, when you try to build systems, you have to define what an object is, and it's usually up to people to define, okay, is the shirt on someone's body part of them? Is it one object? Should we think of this as a different object? So it gets tricky. And there's hierarchy, right? Are these, this stack of bananas just one object? Is it individual objects that are attached to each other? So putting aside all those complications of defining what an object is and how you think about it, the features of these objects are distributed in the brain. If I'm just looking at one object, then my brain is representing this object, and there's not much of a problem. Again, there's hierarchy, whether the stem is part of the same object and whatnot, but don't worry about it. But let's say I'm representing all of this object, and I don't have a binding problem because there aren't multiple objects in my periphery to create issues. But let's say I'm looking at a scene that has more objects in it. There are features that are shared. So if I'm getting some, red feature being activated in my brain, and some round features are being activated, and some, other features are being activated, how do I know they're part of this, ketchup bottle uh, object, or they're part of this pepper object, right? Can you see the problem? So if this is all distributed in the brain and different cells are responding, and there are a bunch of cells that are saying there is redness in here, and there are a bunch of cells saying that there is like, vertical edges and horizontal edges and all sorts of other stuff, you could imagine that some of these features belong to one object, some other ones belong to another object. You see the problem? You see what the problem it poses? And that's what people call the binding problem, because it requires you to bind features of one object together in order to create a percept of that object. In this case, this bottle is hiding behind these fruits, but you're still able to create a coherent perception of it, even though it shares certain features with another object. You don't mistake that this red is part of here. And the reason is, as I said, a lot of time have to do with the space. When you attend to this area of a space, you create a coherent percept of the object in that space, because attending to that allows the features from this bottle to compete and win that competition versus other objects, so they collectively become bound together because they're overrepresented. And also looking at it helps, right? So as I was saying, there's covert attention when you're keeping fixation and attending in the periphery. But if you're looking at it, as you know, when you're looking at something, they're overrepresented in the brain because, well, fovea is overrepresented in the brain. So that also helps them to win those competitions and be represented more. Yes.
So how, I feel like I'm seeing like a binding problem with just like the apple photo, because it's like, I'm attending to this object, and then like my brain is like breaking up the constituent qualities or features of this object, but there's no like unifying principle in the brain to like bring them back together necessarily, right? So like, how does the brain like maintain like that these like disparate qualities like belong to the same object?
So you could imagine that there are cells that have this whole apple in their receptor field.
Oh, okay.
And those cells are only signaling apple, right? Does that make sense? So a lot of time this problem has to be resolved in hierarchy. So if you have a hierarchy of areas and the lower ones are looking at the smaller part of this object. So if one cell, many cells have receptive field that are this small, right? As I'm showing it here, for example, those cells don't perceive apples. They can't.
Yeah.
All they see is a small, area of the space, which they could see as dark red or something like that.
Yeah.
Another one could see this area of a space and see a stem. But if I go up higher, then I have cells that are in the area IT and have this whole apple in their receptive field. And those cells are only seeing apple. They can signal apple. They don't have to. So the coherence in that case comes from the coordinated response of many cells that have the entire apple in their receptive field. That signals coherence in some ways.
So
That's
is it, like passed down in like a serial light. So is it like just like happening so rapid? Is there sort of temporal aspect where it's like the sort of lower parts of the hierarchy are like, detecting edges, detecting color, like the sort of lower level things, and then it's just like passing it up so quickly to the parts that say apple?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
the part that says apple is somewhere else, right? So let's say this linguistic processing happens somewhere else. But the signal that comes from area IT is consistently one object. That's what the way to think about it. But the signal coming from one area, it means a distributed representation of many cells. Collectively, they're signaling in a certain direction. That makes sense. So if you have a vector in a space, that doesn't help you. The idea is that when you have only a one object in the receptive field, then that one object could be represented by cells that contain that in the receptive field. Now, the problem on this side, on the right side, is that those objects don't have only one object in their receptive field, right? When you go highest in the hierarchy, then you'll have multiple objects in your in the receptive field, so they cannot have they cannot give you a coherent response that could be interpreted as an object. So, for example, if you look here where my mouse is, and then I ask you what are the objects in the periphery, are you able to do that?
Maybe pineapple.
Yeah, because like why? Because it's a much larger object, and in the periphery there's a lot of convergence. The larger object kind of the features are still detectable in the periphery. I mean, we'll talk more about foveal and peripheral area processing later on next week. But the idea is that the receptive field of all the cells that are looking at the periphery are large. Does that make sense? So if you're looking at this area, you see my mouse, yeah. If you're looking at this area, every cell that has a receptive field in area IT gonna include all those objects pretty much. Does that make sense? Because they're so large. But if I'm looking directly at here, at the catch-up, then I have very small foveal receptive field now that are not including the other stuff. So they can resolve the features and bind them together because now you have enough cells in the IT that are just signaling catch-up. Does that make sense?
That's helpful.
So looking at it helps you because again, the receptive fields are smaller, the convergence is smaller. The smaller convergence from the exam, means higher resolution. Higher resolution means you get the details. You can even read what is written here, right? And that is only possible because you have a small receptive field. If you have a small receptive field, you could see all the differences. If you're not looking at it in the periphery, everything is so large. So attention to this specific area, to this bottle, with your eye, when you're looking at it directly, allows those features to win those competitions or be represented more and be represented by a coherent group of cells because you're looking at it. So it's a large number of cells. We talked about it, right? What you're foveating at gets overrepresented in the brain, and that kind of carries over because it's retinotopic. It kind of carries over from the cone cells, and it's overrepresented in the rest of the brain, creating a coherent response in the area IT that can eventually be signaled and then read out by other areas as being a catch-up. So hierarchy solves a lot of problems in the brain and society. No, I'm not gonna go there. Anyway, like I know you all want to, what is it, the flat? I don't know what did they call it? Non-hierarchy. In my leftist group friends, they use a term for it, but I don't remember what it is. Horizontal, so what did they call it? Something like that. So according to feature integration theory, the fact that these are all distributed representation creates a problem, right? The fact that the representation is distributed has its pros that we talked about before, that it's more robust, that it's more expressive, it's more efficient, but also creates its own problem where you're saying now that all these features are distributed, what if I have I'm looking at multiple chairs and they're all red, and how do I know which red goes with which one and all those sorts of things? Because then I have all these signals just floating around. The idea is that you have two stages. You have the pre-attentive stage where you have not yet have deployed top-down attention to one of them, but rather all these features are being processed in parallel. Now, this is the connection to parallel and serial. So features are all detected in parallel for the entire scene. And then there's a second stage of attention, selective attention. And that stage is where the features of individual objects get bound together. So this is the solution to so attention exists as a solution to the binding problem. And the binding problem is what? That the features of different objects could be mistaken that this is a feature of that object or this is a feature of this object. As you could imagine, if you're looking, as I said, if you're looking here and trying to decide, if I tell you, oh, there is I don't know, there is a pepper in the periphery, what color is it? Right? I could say it could be yellow because I'm getting some yellow in the periphery. I'm getting some red in the right. You wouldn't be able to tell me what color is the pepper in the periphery if you're looking right here, because it's in the periphery, features get mixed together, and it's hard to, resolve what feature belongs to which fruit. Pineapple has a stereotypical color, so you could tell it, but peppers could come in different colors. So if you look here and decide what color is the pepper, it would be a difficult task. And that's the problem of binding. The way you resolve it, the way you resolve it is you look at it and you see, well, look, the pepper is the red one and the yellow was from the banana. So we have a pre-attentive stage, and then we have a focused attention or selective attention stage. In the pre-attentive stage, the features are not yet bound. They're distributed. They're in different maps, different brain areas even. And then in the attention stage, the features are combined. They're bound together. You know what feature belongs to which object. Now, people may use different terms for this. As I was saying, there is, some people may call this, system 1 processing or system 2 processing. Some people may call this bottom-up processing, call this top-down processing. It's unconscious, conscious processing. So those terms, they all exist out there and people use them and they don't map cleanly to one another. But in the context of attention, you call this pre-attentive, you call this focused attention or selective attention stage. One thing, yeah.
This is relative to attention, but like visual attention, not like, what about like auditory?
No, it's relevant to all. Yeah. So let's say you're in a room and you're trying to listen to somebody, you're focusing your attention on them. But before that, there is a pre-attentive stage, right? And maybe if you hear your name, then you start attending to that person and try to hear them. But there was this pre-attentive processing for you to be able to detect your name, for example, right? This is attention in general, where you could have these two stages. As I said, it could be as broad as any unconscious versus conscious processing. Now, earlier, there was a question about this being, so where do you put the line, right? And that's a weird, that's a difficult question to answer. Like, meaning that at what point is it pre-attentive? Like, for example, if you came in, you opened the door and you weren't attending, you have no any conscious memory of it. Was that part all pre-attentive? Or where is the line? Like, but for me to have interacted with the door and opened it, I must have combined a lot of features together in order to act on it. How is that all pre-attentive? It wasn't just a single feature, and that's a problem with a lot of these theories. And people argue a lot over early selection or late selection. So meaning that selection is not that early. You could do some feature combination in order for you to act upon the world without attention. And then the selection is kind of late. So what you attend to is much later in the processing stage. Yeah. Well, I think a lot of time in life you have to do experiments. I feel like if I was saying, when you're looking at this the S here, and then you were tasked with, you know, reading a words, like 3 words past you, then you're not going to be able to read it, right? But you're not going to feel it as jumbled out there. The fact that you are doing the task tells you that, well, there is something going on, that I'm not, a lot of time our perception of the world is not as rich as we think it is, right? And that's, I think, a problem that somebody would say, this is an example someone used, like, is the fridge light open all the time? Is the fridge light on all the time? That's the question someone would ask you, and you would say, is the fridge light on all the time or no? No? How do you know? Every time I opened it, there was light, right? So that's what, but imagine without the lag. You could say every time I try to open, like I opened it, it was on. So to me, it must always be on, right? And that's the problem of perception a lot of time. That unless you try to, right, you don't know because you are the one who are doing the act of perception. But in an experiment, you could show people how bad they are at recognizing things in the periphery, or there are a lot of demos where they show you, like, have you seen a change detection demo where something in the scene, something significant in the scene changes, but you're not able to like you have 2 scenes next to each other and you're trying to detect the changes. And that's also a difficult task because you look at one scene and you think, okay, I'm getting everything. You look at another thing and I'm getting everything, but there's a big difference between them and you're not able to detect it. And that's, I think our perception tricks us into thinking we're getting everything while we're getting very little. All right. That's the feature integration theory. As I said, there's a lot of argument around early selection, meaning that how much pre-attentive processing can happen. And that sort of is a point of debate. I personally would say that a lot more than a lot of people think. That, as I said, you can interact in the world without being conscious of what you're doing. You could be thinking about something else and doing, you know, fold laundry or something like that, and you're able to do all those tasks, and those require you integrating a lot of different stuff and performing complex motor behavior, and all of those things are happening pre-attentively and unconsciously. So a lot of the pre-attentive stage is not as simple as I displayed it here, where you only just process color and process orientation, and everything beyond that is post-attentive. Like, it's not that simple. It's more than that. Okay, so how does the feature integration theory explains the visual search pattern that we saw? Well, it says that if you're able to do the task purely based on pre-attentive processing, you should be very good at it. You should be very fast at it, right? Because pre-attentive processing is quick, that you could do it in parallel. So in this case, pre-attentive processing, which is processing of single features, right? This is before you have to combine features. If you do not have to solve the binding problem, then you're very quick at doing something. That's the point. In this case, do you have to solve the binding problem to tell me there is a red target? No, because, well, it's only a single feature, and I'm not required to bind anything with anything else to answer this question. So you're very quick at it. A parallel pre-attentive analysis tells you that there are a lot of objects in the display that are green and vertical, but only one object that is red. That's all in parallel. So the response does not require you to focus attention. Now, what about this case? Can you do this with pre-attentive processing to tell me that there is a red vertical or not? You cannot, because when you're looking, let's say, at this object up here, can you tell me if there's a red object somewhere in the bottom right? Yeah, probably. Can you tell me if there's a like horizontal? Sure, but can you tell me there's a red vertical object in the bottom right while fixating here? No, you cannot, right? It's just because that requires you to be much closer to that object in order to have a small receptive field, in order to be able to separate those features from its surrounding. Does that make sense? This requires you to have focused attention. Parallel processing is the first stage, but then when you have to be somewhere close to this object in order to combine those features in order to recognize it. Okay. So I just want to tell you about an alternative way of explaining some of these results. And it's about the concept of saliency. You're going to see this concept in different places. In this case, we're talking about visual saliency, but saliency, as I said, is a much more general concept. There are salient events, there are salient memories, there are salient emotional, responses. In this case, we're talking about visual saliency. And the idea is about contrast, right? So what captures your attention, and earlier there was a discussion of what if someone throws those cookies or muffins? Why did they put chocolate in the muffin? But I'm like a tiny. Anyway, so if someone does something salient, or if there's a salient object somewhere, it would attract your attention. If you go and look for your car in a parking lot, and your car is not red, but there is one red car in some corner, it's going to attract your attention. You're going to look at it. So the idea is that the reason something attracts your attention a lot of time could be because of these bottom-up factors of saliency, not because it's necessarily task relevant. Now, it helps if it's salient and also task relevant, that there's something about it that it stands out, but also that it has, like, I don't know, it's a good idea when you travel and you have a luggage that you check in. It's good to maybe tie some salient color or something to it, and it would stand out, and you would be able to find your luggage easier. The reason is that a lot of this has to do with contrast. So if I have like a light blue next to some dark blue, it may not stand out. It may not be very salient. But if I have a red object among blue object, it's so different that it would stand out because it has a very high contrast with its surrounding. Now, lateral inhibition is something that we did not talk about earlier, so don't worry about it. But the idea is that things that are similar to each other a lot of time can laterally inhibit each other, and things that are different from each other, they're not laterally inhibiting one another. So what happens is that the different things can stand out in neural activity. So our visual system computes local measures of feature contrast or saliency. So in the visual system, when you extract features, the features that are next to each other are going to interact with one another. And they try to silence each other when they're very similar, because it is normalization and inhibition. So as a result, the stuff that are different from each other are going to stand out. They're going to have higher activation. So there are a lot of things that impacts neural activity of a cell. One of them is, well, what is the selectivity of a cell? Another thing is that what are the objects that are around that object that is in the receptive field of a cell? And that's another factor that impacts the response of the cell, but we didn't get into it too much. So, for example, if you have an image like this, you could see that the cloud area has a different color from its surrounding. And so it would be a salient. So imagine this is a saliency map. This island looks different from its surrounding. This area looks different from its surrounding. So areas that are different from their surrounding, it would be salient by just the fact that they're different. Again, this is a very homogeneous scene in a lot of ways, but imagine if there was a red tube or something else on this corner, it would attract your attention right away, right? It would just be so salient. So let's say how would this approach explain the data that we talked about? Well, the reason you're very good at this task is not necessarily that there are features that are being captured with only one map that differ between the target and the distractor, but rather the fact that the target is so salient in the sea of green object, a red object is super salient. So you're very quick at this task because you could just go look at it, right? When you look at this, as I said, if you have a red car and it parked in a garage, and then the red car would stand out just because it's so different from its surrounding. If there are multiple red cars, then you're in trouble. But in this case, it's very salient. So if you add more objects, what's going to happen to the search term? Like what's going to happen to the saliency of this object?
Or red objects?
If there are more green objects, it's going to even become more salient. So some people have shown that there is an opposite effect here, that when you have more distractors, then searches can even become faster, right? So you even the reason is that it increases the saliency of your object. So if you have just only a few distractors, you would be very quick. But even if you have more distractors, your search even become faster. Like it has an opposite effect. It goes down a little bit, the search time, which is an interesting effect. And it shows that saliency is a big factor. Okay, so in this case, how would the visual saliency explain this pattern of behavior?
So that thing really jumps out per se.
Yeah, so why isn't there a lot of contrast here?
Because there are like there's even amount of different colors, and then also the it's not that like we're only looking for a color and an orientation, and so there are more opportunities for there to be more similarities than there are for there to be like a really strong contrast.
Yeah, so it really depends on the surrounding, right? Earlier we talked about it. When you're searching for Waldo, it's not necessarily the properties of that target that defines your search behavior. And that's a criticism maybe to the feature integration theory to some extent, and that's why it has evolved over time, where that it was all about how do you combine the features of the target. But your target could be supposedly complex, but you still have a very quick search time. For example, if you have if you go ahead and change this 3 red bars to green, right? What would happen to the saliency of this object if I change these to green? It's going to go up. But locally, it's going to go up, right? There are still a lot of the red horizontal bar other parts of the scene, but in this part of the scene, it would not be as it would be salient if I change the color of these two objects to green. So what the saliency theory is doing is that it's bringing the idea that, well, we have to know what the surrounding of an objects are. In this case, for example, as we have it on the screen, this object is not very salient because, well, it shares some features with these red bars. It's both red. It shares some features with these green bars. They're both horizontal, vertical. So there is no feature that makes this object salient among the distractors that it has surrounding it. And for that reason, if you plot the saliency map, it's not going to be very salient. It's going to be a little maybe salient combination of two maps, but it's not going to be very salient. So it's not going to stand out to you. You're not going to, if you start pretty much always, we start search in the middle, in the center of the image. If you start in the center of the image, you're not going to be drawn to this but you're gonna be like, okay, I'm gonna look here, here, maybe there. And then when I come here, I see, okay, maybe I'll move down here. So the idea that something has to be salient in order for you to from its surrounding, for it to actually stand out, for you to be able to have a quick search of it. If not, then the search would take a long time because you have to look at different objects and then arrive at that location. So I think the fact that search is not just dependent, that the search behavior is not just dependent on the properties of the object itself, but also what is surrounded with, like how salient it is in that surrounding. It could be a complex object, but if it's really different from its surrounding, then it wouldn't be a difficult search. Does that make sense? So you can imagine there are ideas that would combine the two, right? So saliency is important, but also like how complex the target is important, and many other factors. For example, in a scene, if you're looking for certain object, if I'm looking for a trash can in this room, I'll probably look at the corners, right? I'm not gonna search between the seats for a trash can, right? So we use a lot of heuristics in order to guide our search behavior, as we use heuristics to guide any behavior that we have. Because, as I think I talked about this in the context of object recognition, we use a lot of cues and heuristics to categorize objects, to recognize objects. Similarly, when we have a search behavior, we use a lot of cues in order to, guide our search behavior. So if I am looking at a scene and I'm searching for something, well, just from the processing of the scene, I know certain areas of the scene are likely to have the objects that I'm looking for, right? If I'm looking for a microwave in a kitchen scene, well, I know I look on the counter, or I look on top of the oven or something. That's part of it. Another part of it is well, how different it is from its surrounding. If it's a black microwave in a white cabinet, then it's easier to find because it's more different from its surrounding. And those sorts of things. So a lot of different factors goes into the attention behavior, like the serial attention behavior. We know a lot, like we learn how to attend to different things as quickly as possible if you need to do a task. Any questions about this? You feel comfortable about serial and parallel processing for the most part, right? So let's see. I think I've said yeah. Yeah, I think lots of jobs require you to be good at searching, I would say. Like a good example of it is, let's say, radiologists. That's all they do. They look at the scans and they're searching for tumors or malignant, tissue or something like that. So they're expert searchers, and they're, one of the populations that attention researchers study. They get these radiologists and study their behavior. People who work at TSA and check bags, that's all they do. Basically, they look at these scans and search as quickly. Like, I mean, they have one bag in front of them for how long? I don't know, 2 seconds or something, right? So they can, 2 seconds, you can make what, 7, 8 fixations, right? So that's what they do. People in the military who do radial imaging and they look for enemy stuff. That's what they do basically.
If someone is like bad at finding their hairbrush, or using Where's Waldo search games, like help them get better? Like,
I'm not sure. Maybe it translates like depending on. I think bad at finding hairbrush in a bag or bad at. Um, I feel like it's more has like I feel like it has more to do with organizing your things in a way that are easier to find than to um yeah. I'm not sure, but my guess is people who do those jobs get much better at it over time. But I don't know if it's translates to other domains of their life in terms of search.